He burst into a billionaire's wedding with a baby in his arms, and one word stopped everything. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The sun-drenched coastline of southern Florida shimmered in the afternoon light, casting golden rays over the lavish estate that stood like a white palace against the sky. Seagulls circled lazily above as a warm ocean breeze rustled the thousands of imported lilies adorning every column and table of the Haverworth family's seaside villa. It was a day designed to be remembered, a wedding crafted not only for love, but for legacy, reputation, and spectacle. Inside the sprawling, glass-walled reception hall, over 300 guests sat in polished rows of white and gold chairs. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved quietly between them, offering sparkling champagne and elegant hors d'oeuvres. String musicians played beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers, and every surface gleamed with wealth and meticulous planning. Cameras rolled silently from strategic corners, some for the couple's private archive, others for the live broadcast being fed to carefully selected screens across the globe. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a statement. At the altar, under a towering arch of white roses and twisted vines, stood Robert Haverworth, a man who exuded quiet power. At 48, his silver-streaked hair and refined jawline spoke of a life carved with purpose and ambition. His tailored tuxedo hugged a frame, still athletic from early years in military service and late nights at exclusive gyms. Robert was the founder and CEO of H-Tech, one of the leading biotech firms in the Western Hemisphere, a pioneer of controversial yet revolutionary medical research. But today, he was just a man getting married. Beside him, radiant in a bespoke gown of pearl silk, stood Melissa Dane. An actress turned philanthropist, she carried the kind of elegance that photographers craved. Poised, statuesque, with a rehearsed smile and calm that never cracked. Her dark blonde hair shimmered beneath her veil, and her diamond necklace, a piece once belonging to a French duchess, glinted under the lights. She gripped her bouquet tightly, her manicured nails pressing into the stems. In the front row, Sylvania Haverworth sat straight-backed and severe. The matriarch of the Haverworth family, she wore navy instead of the traditional mother-of-the-groom pastels. Her expression, carved from decades of discipline and boardroom battles, remained unreadable. Nothing about her presence was warm, yet no one could deny that Sylvania's approval hovered over the day like a crown. Her influence over Robert and over H-Tech was infamous. The officiant, a solemn man in black robes, cleared his throat as he reached the traditional line. If anyone present can show just cause why this couple may not lawfully be joined in matrimony, he said, his voice carrying to the last row of guests, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. There was a beat of silence, exactly as planned. The quartet stopped playing. The only sounds were the ocean and the distant cry of gulls. Melissa smiled gently at Robert, and Robert, for once, allowed himself to believe that everything was as it should be. Then the silence cracked. "I object!" The voice was young, alarmingly young, and sharp enough to snap the air in two. Heads turned in confusion. Murmurs erupted like ripples in a pond. The officiant froze. Robert's brow furrowed. Down the center aisle, under the stunned gaze of 300 of the world's wealthiest and most influential, walked a child. He was a boy, no more than 11 years old, with skin the color of deep earth and a face worn far too early by struggle. His clothes were wrinkled, too small, and mismatched. Dust clung to his sleeves and the frayed cuffs of his pants, but he walked with purpose, undeterred by the grandeur around him or the gasps trailing in his wake. And in his arms, wrapped in a thin, faded blue blanket, was an infant. A white infant. The baby fussed gently as the boy clutched him close to his chest, adjusting the bundle with the awkward grace of someone too young to carry such responsibility but too determined to let it go. He stopped at the front row. The security team had risen but hesitated, waiting for instruction, perhaps unable to fathom the protocol for a child interrupting a billion-dollar wedding. The boy looked directly at Robert. "You're my dad," he said, voice steady and unflinching, "and this is my little brother." Melissa gasped audibly. Sylvania's hand jerked upward, signaling her head of security. But before anyone could move, Robert took a single step forward. "What did you say?" The boy blinked, his arms tightening protectively around the infant. "You're my father. My name's Elias. This is Milo. Our mom, Joy, she died 4 days ago. She told me to find you. She said you'd know what to do." He burst into a billionaire's wedding with a baby in his arms, and one word stopped everything. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The sun-drenched coastline of southern Florida shimmered in the afternoon light, casting golden rays over the lavish estate that stood like a white palace against the sky. Seagulls circled lazily above as a warm ocean breeze rustled the thousands of imported lilies adorning every column and table of the Haverworth family's seaside villa. It was a day designed to be remembered, a wedding crafted not only for love, but for legacy, reputation, and spectacle. Inside the sprawling, glass-walled reception hall, over 300 guests sat in polished rows of white and gold chairs. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved quietly between them, offering sparkling champagne and elegant hors d'oeuvres. String musicians played beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers, and every surface gleamed with wealth and meticulous planning. Cameras rolled silently from strategic corners, some for the couple's private archive, others for the live broadcast being fed to carefully selected screens across the globe. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a statement. At the altar, under a towering arch of white roses and twisted vines, stood Robert Haverworth, a man who exuded quiet power. At 48, his silver-streaked hair and refined jawline spoke of a life carved with purpose and ambition. His tailored tuxedo hugged a frame, still athletic from early years in military service and late nights at exclusive gyms. Robert was the founder and CEO of H-Tech, one of the leading biotech firms in the Western Hemisphere, a pioneer of controversial yet revolutionary medical research. But today, he was just a man getting married. Beside him, radiant in a bespoke gown of pearl silk, stood Melissa Dane. An actress turned philanthropist, she carried the kind of elegance that photographers craved. Poised, statuesque, with a rehearsed smile and calm that never cracked. Her dark blonde hair shimmered beneath her veil, and her diamond necklace, a piece once belonging to a French duchess, glinted under the lights. She gripped her bouquet tightly, her manicured nails pressing into the stems. In the front row, Sylvania Haverworth sat straight-backed and severe. The matriarch of the Haverworth family, she wore navy instead of the traditional mother-of-the-groom pastels. Her expression, carved from decades of discipline and boardroom battles, remained unreadable. Nothing about her presence was warm, yet no one could deny that Sylvania's approval hovered over the day like a crown. Her influence over Robert and over H-Tech was infamous. The officiant, a solemn man in black robes, cleared his throat as he reached the traditional line. "If anyone present can show just cause why this couple may not lawfully be joined in matrimony," he said, his voice carrying to the last row of guests, "let them speak now or forever hold their peace." There was a beat of silence, exactly as planned. The quartet stopped playing. The only sounds were the ocean and the distant cry of gulls. Melissa smiled gently at Robert, and Robert, for once, allowed himself to believe that everything was as it should be. Then the silence cracked. "I object!" The voice was young, alarmingly young, and sharp enough to snap the air in two. Heads turned in confusion. Murmurs erupted like ripples in a pond. The officiant froze. Robert's brow furrowed. Down the center aisle, under the stunned gaze of 300 of the world's wealthiest and most influential, walked a child. He was a boy, no more than 11 years old, with skin the color of deep earth and a face worn far too early by struggle. His clothes were wrinkled, too small, and mismatched. Dust clung to his sleeves and the frayed cuffs of his pants, but he walked with purpose, undeterred by the grandeur around him or the gasps trailing in his wake. And in his arms, wrapped in a thin, faded blue blanket, was an infant. A white infant. The baby fussed gently as the boy clutched him close to his chest, adjusting the bundle with the awkward grace of someone too young to carry such responsibility but too determined to let it go. He stopped at the front row. The security team had risen but hesitated, waiting for instruction, perhaps unable to fathom the protocol for a child interrupting a billion-dollar wedding. The boy looked directly at Robert. "You're my dad," he said, voice steady and unflinching, "and this is my little brother." Melissa gasped audibly. Sylvania's hand jerked upward, signaling her head of security. But before anyone could move, Robert took a single step forward. "What did you say?" The boy blinked, his arms tightening protectively around the infant. "You're my father. My name's Elias. This is Milo. Our mom, Joy, she died 4 days ago. She told me to find you. She said you'd know what to do." A television producer whispered into her Bluetooth earpiece, already preparing an emergency news segment. Robert looked down at the boy, Elias, and noticed the wear on his shoes, the frayed seam of his jacket sleeve, and the thinness of his wrists. The child looked like he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. His skin was dry and windburned, and his posture, rigid yet ready to bolt, betrayed more than fear. It was the tension of someone who had relied on himself for far too long. "Come with me," Robert said gently. Elias nodded and followed. They passed through a narrow side hallway, away from the guests, through a pair of private double doors that led into the east wing of the villa. The staff had been dismissed or ordered to stay out of sight, but a butler appeared from a side room and opened the door to Robert's private lounge without being asked. Once inside, the heavy oak door closed behind them with a soft click. The room was dim, elegant, and quiet. Leather-bound books lined the shelves, and a low fire smoldered in the fireplace beneath a massive oil painting of the Haverworth patriarch, Robert's grandfather. Robert moved to the sofa and sat down, carefully adjusting Milo in his arms. The infant stirred, let out a small hoarse breath, then settled again. Robert could hear a faint wheeze that tightened his chest with something like panic. Elias remained standing, one hand resting on the back of a chair. He didn't look around the room or admire the grandeur. His eyes were locked on the baby. "How long has he been sick?" Robert asked softly. "A few days," Elias said. "Started wheezing the morning after Mama died. Got worse yesterday." "You took him to a hospital?" Elias shook his head. "I didn't know how. They said they'd split us up. I heard the nurses whispering." His voice dropped. "Said foster care, that we'd be separated. He's just a baby." Robert nodded slowly. He understood now, not just the urgency in Elias's voice, but the sheer desperation of what had driven this boy to interrupt the most powerful moment of a man's public life. Elias wasn't trying to embarrass him. He was trying to protect what little family he had left. "Why today?" Robert asked. Elias stepped forward, reached into the inside pocket of his coat, and pulled out a folded, tattered newspaper clipping. He held it out. Robert took it and unfolded it slowly. It was a glossy lifestyle magazine article featuring Robert and Melissa smiling, posed in matching designer attire. The headline read, "Tech Titan Ties the Knot. Exclusive details from the upcoming Haverworth-Dane wedding." At the bottom, printed in bold, was the date, location, and time of the ceremony. "It was in Mama's drawer," Elias said, "with the photo. She told me if anything ever happened to her, I should find you. She made me memorize your name, your company, your face." Robert's hand, still holding the clipping, trembled slightly. "You remember your mother's full name?" he asked. "Joy Hunter," Elias said. "She was a nurse. She said you met her a long time ago. You helped with something in a clinic. She said you were smart, but that your mama didn't like her." That last part hit harder than expected. Robert leaned back, drawing a long, uneven breath. His mind was reaching, groping through time and memory, back to a narrow window of weeks from over a decade ago. He had volunteered in an underfunded urban health center during one of H-Tech's early initiatives. There had been a woman, yes, Joy, soft-spoken, sharp-witted, and warm. They had shared a handful of late-night conversations in the cramped break room. She made him laugh. He remembered the dimple in her right cheek, the way she could silence chaos with a look, the way she listened. And yes, he had kissed her. Once, maybe twice. Afterward, his mother had insisted the program be shut down. She claimed the optics were bad, that the time was better spent focusing on expansion and patents. Robert hadn't thought to question her. He had moved on, or believed he had. He looked back at Elias, then at Milo. The baby stirred again. His breathing still wasn't right. Robert stood and carried him to the small bar in the corner where a silver intercom was hidden behind a panel. He pressed a button. "Get me Dr. Isaacs immediately. Tell him to come to the villa. Bring everything he needs for a respiratory assessment. Infant, approximately 6 months. Urgent." He turned back to Elias. "He'll be here within the hour." Elias's shoulders slumped slightly, a crack in the armor. "Thank you," the boy whispered. A knock came at the door. Robert opened it. A tall woman in a gray blazer and government-issued ID stood just outside, flanked by a uniformed officer. Her badge read, "Lucy Martinez, Department of Child Protective Services." "I'm looking for Elias Hunter," she said calmly, "and Milo Hunter. They were reported missing from a hospital 2 days ago." Robert's jaw tensed. He moved to shield Elias slightly, instinctively. "They're safe," he said, "and they're staying here." "With respect, sir," Lucy said gently, "that's not how this works. We need to assess the situation." Elias clutched Robert's jacket. "Don't let them take us." Robert looked down at him, then back at Lucy. "Come in," he said, "but I think you'll want to hear what I have to say first." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of tense conversations and urgent explanations. Lucy listened carefully. Elias, tired but brave, recounted the last days with his mother, the hospital, the whispers, the escape. Robert produced the photo, the clipping, even the call he had just placed to a doctor. He told Lucy he wanted a paternity test immediately, that he was prepared to provide housing, care, legal guardianship, whatever was necessary. She remained professional, but Robert could see the change in her posture, the gradual softening in her gaze. This wasn't the first time she'd seen a man try to distance himself from responsibility. but it was, perhaps, one of the few times she'd seen someone run toward it. "I'll need documentation," she said finally. "We'll start with temporary protective custody. You'll be their foster guardian for now. If the DNA confirms it, we'll proceed with permanent arrangements." Robert nodded. As she turned to go, she added, "I'd recommend canceling any remaining celebrations. The press will smell this within the hour." "They already have," Robert muttered. When she left, Elias sat down on the velvet armchair, arms wrapped around himself. The boy, who had walked into a storm without flinching, now looked like a child again. Robert knelt beside him. "I don't know what's coming," he said, "but I promise I'm not going to let you go through it alone." Elias didn't answer right away. Then he reached into his coat one last time and handed Robert something small and worn. It was a baby sock, faded blue, with a tiny stitched letter M at the ankle. "Milo's favorite," Elias said. "He won't sleep without it." Robert turned it over in his hand, the fabric barely heavier than air. Something sharp and painful twisted in his chest. He looked at Milo, then Elias, then the sock again. He wasn't sure what kind of man he'd been 11 years ago, but now he had a choice. And for the first time in his life, he intended to make the right one. The early evening light filtered through the tall windows of the Haverworth estate, softening the edges of what had become a day marked by upheaval and unfinished truths. The faint sound of waves rolling in from the shoreline was a distant hush now, barely audible over the low hum of a waiting house staff that no longer knew what to do. The wedding guests had all departed, some with hurried apologies, others with thinly veiled smirks and buzzing phones, eager to relay what they'd witnessed to the world. The grand floral displays remained untouched, a celebration frozen mid-breath. Robert stood in his private study, leaning with both hands on the marble edge of the fireplace mantel, his tuxedo jacket discarded over a nearby chair. His bow tie was undone, the collar of his shirt rumpled and open. He had been motionless for several minutes, staring at the unlit hearth, the baby sock Elias had given him still in one hand. Milo was asleep upstairs under the watchful care of Dr. Isaacs, who had arrived with a portable oxygen machine and a quiet professionalism that reassured everyone in the room. The infant's breathing was under control for now, though the diagnosis wasn't final. Elias had also been bathed and changed into clean clothes provided by the staff. He was now resting in one of the guest rooms down the hall. Lucy Martinez had arranged for temporary custody paperwork to be filed that evening, giving Robert legal cover to house the boys until a formal decision could be reached. There were still layers of bureaucracy ahead: home evaluations, background checks, court hearings, but the social worker had made it clear that, given the circumstances, this was the most immediate and humane step. And Robert hadn't blinked at any of it. But beneath the surface of that new resolve churned a storm of memory, guilt, and something dangerously close to rage. Rage at himself, at his mother, at the years he had lost and the silence he had accepted. He had believed for a long time that he was a man in control of his world, a man of plans and systems, of measurable results and concrete achievements. But a boy with his eyes and a baby with his blood, or something more tangled than blood, had arrived and shattered the illusion in seconds. He picked up the photograph again, the one Elias had carried in his coat. It had been taken in a modest clinic, he now recalled, on the outskirts of a failing neighborhood in Baltimore. The program had been part of an early H-Tech outreach initiative, one that Sylvania had agreed to only because of the publicity value. Robert had spent 2 months there, working alongside overworked nurses and med techs, learning far more than he had bargained for. And then there was Joy. She had been different. Smart, certainly. She had challenged him in ways that others hadn't. She'd had opinions about ethics, about how research wasn't just a vehicle for advancement or fortune. She believed in people, not processes. They had shared late-night conversations about medical equity and corporate overreach, words that, at the time, felt theoretical. But her passion had left a mark on him. They had fallen into something warm and unexpected, though never fully defined. He hadn't called it love, and neither had she, but it had meant something. And then he had left. He remembered the argument how his mother had suddenly pulled him from the clinic under the pretense of a corporate emergency, how he'd been redirected to investor meetings, patent discussions, new strategic developments. He had assumed that if Joy truly wanted to stay in touch, she would. But now that assumption rang hollow. Sylvania. Robert turned away from the fireplace and crossed to the tall cabinet in the corner. He opened the doors, revealing rows of aged scotch and crystal tumblers. He poured himself 2 fingers of Macallan, then stared into the amber liquid for a long time before raising it to his lips. He didn't drink often, not anymore, but the burn was grounding. Just as he lowered the glass, the door opened without a knock. She never knocked. Sylvania entered the room like she had designed it, which she had decades ago. Her presence filled the space even without a word. She wore a different outfit now, something darker, simpler, more appropriate for what had become an impromptu family crisis. Her platinum hair was still perfectly arranged, and her expression bore the kind of calm only someone with long practice in damage control could manage. "We need to talk," she said. Robert didn't turn. "I thought we already said enough today." "This isn't about the wedding," she replied. "This is about the company." He exhaled through his nose and finally faced her. "Of course it is." She stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Charles McConaughey called an emergency board meeting for Monday. He's already pressuring the investors to reassess your role as CEO. He's using today's events to paint you as unstable. The press is eating it up. You abandoned a high-profile wedding to claim paternity of a child you've never met, based solely on the word of an 11-year-old. It's reckless, Robert." He set the glass down harder than he meant to. "Is that what you think this is? Reckless?" "I think," she said carefully, "that emotion makes for poor leadership." "They're children," he said coldly. "One of them might be mine, and the other, he has no one else. You don't even know if that's true." "Maybe because someone made sure I never got the chance to find out." Sylvania's expression didn't change, but a shadow passed through her eyes. She looked older in that moment, less like the unshakable architect of his empire, and more like a woman who had made decisions she couldn't undo. "You intercepted her messages," he said, voice low. "Didn't you?" Silence, long enough to confirm everything. "She called," he said. "She wrote, and you never told me." "She was a distraction," Sylvania replied, her voice tightening. "You were about to close a deal on our first patent. You needed to focus. She would have ruined everything. She was the mother of my child." "She was a nurse," Sylvania said, her tone like stone. "You were being groomed to lead a multi-billion-dollar company. I did what was necessary to protect your future." He turned away again, fists clenched. "You protected a lie. I protected the truth you didn't want to face." He laughed bitterly. "And what truth is that?" "That you were never going to be just a man, Robert. You were a legacy. That means sacrifices. Not everyone gets to have normal lives. Not everyone gets to indulge their mistakes. I don't think she was a mistake, he said quietly. Sylvania didn't respond. Instead, she crossed to the bar and poured herself a drink. Something she almost never did. She sipped it, turned to the window, and for a moment looked almost human. "You're not thinking clearly," she said after a pause. "You're emotional. You're letting this boy manipulate you." "He's not manipulating anyone. He showed up at a wedding he couldn't possibly have found without help, carrying a sick baby and begging for protection. That's not manipulation. That's survival." "He disrupted your life," she said. "He might have saved it," Robert countered. They stood in silence. Finally, she spoke again. "You have 48 hours before the board convenes. Use them wisely." She turned and left, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and decades of unspoken truths. Later that night, as the house grew quiet and the ocean winds picked up beyond the glass, Robert stood in the nursery where Milo now slept. A temporary crib had been set up, and Elias lay on a cot nearby, curled under a thick blanket, one hand resting on the edge of Milo's bassinet. They had made a place for themselves without asking, without permission, as if they had belonged here all along. He stood in the doorway for a long time watching them, and in that stillness something shifted. He had spent a lifetime building something grand, sterile, and safe, but perhaps it was time to build something real. That meant facing the past, every shadow of it. Morning broke without the usual serenity that often bathed the Haverworth estate in warmth. The sun rose behind a veil of cloud, casting a dull, filtered glow over the manicured gardens and still-sleeping fountains. Inside the house, tension moved like static through the air. The staff whispered in corridors, unsure whether to resume their regular duties or await further instruction. The wedding, once the focus of every movement in the house, had dissolved like fog, leaving behind something far more uncertain, a legal storm that was already building at the door. Robert had barely slept. He had spent much of the night at his desk, sifting through old digital records, searching for archived messages, hospital files, anything that might prove Joy Hunter had attempted to contact him in the past. But whatever communications might have existed were gone. Deleted, redirected, erased, perhaps by a secretary under someone else's direction. He didn't need a forensic team to know who had ensured those attempts would never reach him. His mother's hand was all over it. The same mother who had built his world and without hesitation buried parts of it when they threatened her version of success. He had barely stepped into the breakfast room when Mary Winters, his general counsel, arrived with a thick folder under her arm and urgency in her stride. She didn't wait to be seated. She placed the folder on the table and opened it. "The test came back this morning," she said without preamble. Robert set down his coffee. "You're the biological father of Elias. 99.9% probability. The labs rushed it through." A sigh of something like relief escaped him, but it was short-lived. "And Milo?" Mary hesitated, her lips tightening. She slid another page forward. "No paternal match," she said gently. "You're not the biological father." Robert nodded slowly. He had suspected as much. Milo's fair skin had raised questions from the start, but the confirmation struck deeper than he'd expected. Not because he doubted Elias or his bond with the child, but because it brought into question yet another layer of Joy's story. "Then who is?" "We don't know." The lab flagged no immediate database match. The mother's identity is confirmed as Joy Hunter from hospital records, birth certificate, and a DNA sample from her autopsy file. But the father? unknown. He absorbed that silently. Elias hadn't mentioned anyone else. He had spoken of Milo as a brother, with the language of conviction and familial loyalty that wasn't born from blood, but from promise. Whatever the truth of Milo's paternity, it didn't change what Robert had seen, the way Elias protected him, carried him, fed him, soothed him. A child shouldn't have had to carry such weight. But Elias had, and without complaint. He rubbed his temples. What are our options? Mary closed the folder and folded her hands. The court will default to bloodline preference in contested custody unless a legal guardian is explicitly designated in writing. For Elias, that means you're already the strongest candidate. Milo, however, will require a separate petition, unless someone else presents a legal claim. Robert looked up. You think someone will? They already have. A knock sounded on the doorway. Lucy Martinez stepped inside, her expression unreadable. Behind her stood a tall, thin woman with sleek hair and expensive glasses. She wore a tailored gray suit, held a briefcase, and radiated the kind of calculated calm that Robert had seen in corporate assassins and litigation experts. This is Corrine Foster, Lucy said. She's come forward as Milo Hunter's legal guardian. Robert blinked. What? Corrine extended a packet of documents. I was designated by Joy Hunter prior to her death as guardian to her son, Milo. Signed, notarized, witnessed. I'm here to fulfill that responsibility. Robert didn't take the packet. Joy never mentioned a sister. I wasn't her sister, Corrine said smoothly. We were close friends, practically family. She didn't have any blood relatives. She named me in her will. Lucy looked at Robert sympathetically, but her professionalism remained intact. We've begun verifying the paperwork, but under current law, her guardianship claim is valid unless challenged. Challenged. That word rang like an alarm bell in Robert's head. He took a slow breath, then turned to Mary. Start the challenge. Corrine arched an eyebrow. On what grounds? I don't know who you are, Robert said, his voice calm but edged with steel. But I find it very convenient that you appeared less than 24 hours after the children did, on the heels of a ruined wedding, corporate instability, and massive public scrutiny. I'm not here for your company, she replied. I'm here for the boy. Then why is your LinkedIn profile tied to Synergen Partners? Mary asked quietly, opening a tablet and turning it around. A biotech venture capital group with multiple stakeholdings and H-tech competitors. Corrine blinked. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Robert stepped forward. You're not here for Milo. You're here because someone wants leverage, either over me or over this company. And Joy trusted someone. But it wasn't you. Corrine didn't respond, but her jaw tightened. I'll see you in court, Robert said simply. Lucy cleared her throat. Regardless of contested guardianship, Mr. Haverworth, the state cannot delay formal placement for long. We'll need a hearing within 72 hours. I can request temporary joint custody in the meantime, but it's subject to judicial review. Do it. When they left, the room felt emptier than before. The stillness wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum waiting to pull something apart. Later that day, Elias wandered into Robert's study carrying a plastic folder. He clutched it in both hands like something sacred. His eyes looked clearer after rest, but there was a tension to his posture, as though he hadn't fully stopped bracing for impact since the moment he walked into the wedding. I found this in Mama's bag, he said. I was saving it for later, but I think now is later. He placed the folder on the desk and stepped back. Inside was a USB drive sealed in a labeled envelope marked Neosolve Research Private. There were also handwritten notes pages of clinical observation, and a printout with the H-Tech logo from over a decade ago. It was Joy's handwriting, unmistakably careful and methodical. Robert felt his throat close. "What is this?" he asked, already knowing. Elias answered quietly. "Mama said if anything ever happened to her and I found you, I should show it to you. She said the truth was too big to keep hiding." Robert opened the first page. Data tables, sample groups, adverse reactions, terms like respiratory fragility, neonatal inflammation, and statistical anomaly suppression. His eyes scanned faster and faster, and his stomach twisted with each line. Joy hadn't just worked at the clinic. She had been conducting her own observations on Naosolve, one of H-Tech's first major drugs, launched with enormous fanfare 10 years ago, praised for its success in stabilizing newborns with underdeveloped lungs. The company had credited it with saving thousands of premature infants. But here was evidence, hidden in plain handwriting, that the drug had side effects far worse than anyone had disclosed, that Joy had tried to flag them, that those warnings had been ignored, suppressed. And if this was true, if this had been buried on purpose, then someone within H-Tech had made a calculated decision to endanger infants for profit. Possibly his mother. Possibly more. He stared at the drive, then at Elias. "Does Milo?" Elias shook his head. "I don't know. He wheezes sometimes. Mama said it might be connected, but she didn't want to scare me." Robert rose from the desk. He didn't need a court to tell him Milo belonged with Elias, and he didn't need a boardroom to tell him what had to happen next. It was time to stop playing defense and start telling the truth. The storm broke before dawn. It wasn't the kind that rattled windows or drenched streets, but the kind that unfolded in whispers and legal briefs, in social media outrage and quietly scheduled court hearings. Robert sat at the head of the long walnut table in the secondary meeting room on the third floor of the Haverworth estate, his personal war room. The old paintings had been removed from the walls, replaced by whiteboards, legal charts, and projected timelines. Around the table sat his attorney, Mary Winters, two corporate crisis consultants, Lucy Martinez from Child Protective Services, and a private investigator he had flown in overnight from New York. Everyone's faces were tight with urgency. They were running against a clock no one could see. "The documents from Corrine Foster's claim are being taken seriously by the court," Mary said, her voice low but calm. "Unless we can prove she falsified Joy's signature or that she's not who she says she is, the judge might grant her custody over Milo, and she's not working alone. Someone's backing her." "Synergen," Robert said flatly. "It's bigger than Synergen," the investigator added. "We found a chain of transactions linking Corrine to an offshore account managed by Lindor Strategic Holdings. That's one of the ghost companies used in hostile takeovers." "Who owns Lindor?" Robert asked. "We're still digging," the investigator replied, "but one of the signatories on a linked board is a familiar name, Victor Connolly." Robert's mouth tightened. Victor Connolly had once been a junior board member of H-Tech. Years ago, he'd been ousted in a shareholder dispute initiated by Sylvania. He had vowed revenge, but few had taken him seriously. Apparently, he'd been biding his time. "They're building a case," Mary continued. "You're being painted as impulsive, emotionally compromised, and unfit to retain custody of Milo. Meanwhile, the opposition is painting Corrine as the stable, logical choice." "And Elias?" "No one is contesting your paternity," Lucy said gently. "But your ability to provide emotional stability is being questioned. They're arguing that separating Milo and Elias is in the best interest of Milo's health, that you're endangering him by delaying medical care." They're using the baby as leverage, Robert said, rising to his feet. They're using your mother's legacy as a weapon, Mary corrected. And unless we control the narrative, the board may vote to remove you permanently. Robert walked to the window. The gardens below were immaculate, as always. The hedges trimmed into perfect symmetry. The fountains still like frozen music. It struck him as almost offensive that the world could look so orderly when everything inside him and around him was splintering. "I'm calling a press conference," he said. Mary straightened in her chair. "You want to go public with the Neosolva files?" "Yes." "It could destroy the company." Robert turned. "It could also save lives." Lucy leaned forward. "You realize what that means, Mr. Haverworth? If the reports in those files are true, and H-Tech buried clinical data, the lawsuits alone—" "Let them come," he interrupted. "Let everything come. I won't be a man who lets his name be used to hurt children. Not anymore." The room fell silent. Later that afternoon, the estate gates opened to the press. A small podium was erected on the front steps of the main house. Cameramen jockeyed for position. Reporters murmured predictions. No one knew what Robert Haverworth was about to say, only that it had shaken the usual fortress-like silence of the Haverworth brand. Robert stepped out in a simple navy suit. No tie, no Brandon pin, just a man. Behind him stood Mary, Lucy, and Elias, clean, composed, his small hand gripping Robert's. "My name is Robert Haverworth," he began. "Until yesterday, I was the CEO of H-Tech Corporation. Today, I am a father. I'm also a man who must make a reckoning." The speech that followed was not rehearsed. It came from somewhere raw. He spoke of the wedding that never was, of the boy who walked into his life carrying a sick infant and a name from the past. He admitted to his failures, how he had once allowed others to make decisions for him, how he had turned a blind eye to details he should have questioned, how he had let ambition obscure his ethics. He told them about Joy Hunter, about the file she had left behind, about the drug, Neosolva, and the signs she had found that it was harming infants, about the internal resistance she faced, and how her warnings were suppressed, about the price she paid for standing alone against a machine. He held up the USB drive. "This is everything," he said. "Unfiltered, unedited, and undeniable. And today, I'm turning it over to the FDA, to independent medical review boards, and to the families who may have been affected. H-Tech will issue an immediate voluntary recall of Neosolva, fund a full investigation, and begin compensating families without delay." The press erupted in questions. Robert answered as many as he could. He didn't spin. He didn't deflect. He admitted the truth, and in doing so, did something rarer than power. He humbled himself. That evening, after the press had dispersed and social media had exploded with hashtags and praise and outrage, Robert sat once more in the nursery beside Elias and Milo. The room had changed. Flowers from the ceremony now brightened the windowsill. The crib had new blankets. The baby breathed easier. Elias crawled into Robert's lap and asked, "Did you mean it? Everything you said?" "Yes," Robert answered, "even if it means they take Milo." Robert closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them. Especially then. But fate had one more surprise. Lucy returned the next morning, her expression unreadable. She carried an envelope in one hand and her phone in the other. "We received an anonymous tip late last night," she said, "a copy of the guardianship form submitted by Corrine Foster. It's a forgery." Robert stared at her. The notary listed has been dead for 4 years. The seal was digitally replicated from an old government template. We traced the print pattern to a commercial printer owned by Lindor Strategic Holdings. And the court has been informed. Corrine Foster's claim has been withdrawn. She's under investigation for fraud. Robert leaned back, stunned. Who sent the tip? We don't know. The message was encrypted, but I have a guess. She held up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a photograph. Joy and Robert side by side smiling. Behind them, blurry but unmistakable, was a younger version of Charles McConaughey, CEO of Synergen. He stood in the background, watching them. On the back of the photo were just 5 words, written in blue ink. He knew. She knew more. Robert felt the weight of 100 unanswered questions fall heavier. But he also felt something else. Resolve. He looked to the hallway where the court hearing for permanent custody was scheduled to begin within the hour. It was time to finish what had begun the moment a boy walked down a wedding aisle and told the world the truth. The air in the Haverworth estate felt heavier in the days that followed the boardroom confrontation. The silence that filled the marble halls was not the usual, reverent quiet of a well-maintained palace, but something more brittle, as though the walls themselves were listening. Robert had always known that truth came with a cost, but he had not yet measured the depth of that price. He had set the match to the powder keg, and now the tremors had begun. News of the voluntary recall spread with blistering speed. Within hours of the press release, headlines screamed across every business, medical, and mainstream outlet in the country. H-Tech CEO Robert Haverworth acknowledges concealed adverse effects of Neosolv, one read. Another was more direct. Drug that saved thousands may have harmed hundreds. Founder confesses cover-up. Robert hadn't technically confessed to anything yet, but the implication was clear. He had thrown a stone at the glass empire he helped build, and now every piece was cracking. Within 24 hours, the company's stock plunged 17%. 2 major institutional investors withdrew holdings, and several smaller biotech partners froze collaborative projects pending internal reviews. Lawsuits began to materialize. Whispers in lawyers' offices, inquiries from state medical boards, emails marked urgent from compliance officials in Washington. It wasn't just financial, it was foundational. For the first time in H-Tech's brief but brilliant history, it bled. And yet, through it all, Robert didn't retreat. He spent long hours on the phone with attorneys, patient advocacy groups, and regulators. He held 2 press conferences and appeared in a televised interview with a journalist who had once tried to corner him over ethical patents. He didn't flinch. He spoke in measured tones, acknowledged the failures, announced the independent investigation into internal operations, and promised restitution and reform. He didn't name his mother, but he didn't protect her either. Sylvania Haverworth had not spoken to him since the board meeting. She had vacated her offices at corporate headquarters and returned to her private townhouse in the city. Her absence from the press was strategic. No statements, no denials, no appearances. But Robert knew her silence was not surrender. It was recalibration. She was watching, waiting, calculating what she had left to preserve and what she could still destroy. The legal case regarding Milo unfolded in parallel, equally turbulent and charged. Corrine Foster had not backed down. She returned to court with a new team of attorneys and a document that appeared, on the surface, airtight. A notarized letter from Joy Hunter naming her as Milo's guardian. The signature matched official records, and the witnesses included a nurse from the hospice where Joy had spent her final days. But Robert's legal team dug deeper. The nurse had since resigned and, when questioned, admitted under pressure that she had been paid to sign the document without knowing its full contents. The notary's license had expired 6 months before the letter's date. The timeline of events in Corrine's affidavit failed to align with hospice logs, and a handwriting analyst raised concerns about subtle inconsistencies in the signature itself. It was enough to introduce doubt, enough to reopen the question of validity. Yet, even with the legal tides shifting, Robert understood that the battle was not just in court. It was in the hearts of those watching. Public perception was no longer a matter of branding. It was the lens through which judges, agencies, and even Elias himself would measure his worth. And then, one quiet afternoon, the final piece fell into place. Robert had returned from a deposition with the company's legal counsel and stepped into his study to find Elias waiting, seated on the floor with Milo in his lap. The baby was laughing, really laughing for the first time, the gurgling giggle of a child who felt safe enough to forget pain. Elias looked up as Robert entered, and his expression was different, older somehow, though still too young to carry so much. "There's something I have to tell you," the boy said. Robert lowered himself into the chair opposite. "What is it?" "It's about Milo," Elias said, "about who he really is." Robert's chest tightened. "Go on?" "Mama told me something just before she died. She said, if I ever found you, and if you were going to help us, really help us, I could tell you." Robert sat forward, his attention now razor sharp. "She said, Milo's not just my brother, he's your brother too." Robert blinked. "She said your father, William Haverworth, met her about a year ago, not like the first time she met you. She was already sick then, but she said he was kind, said he listened to her. They weren't together for long, but that's where Milo came from." A long silence followed. It didn't make sense. It made perfect sense. His father had died less than a year ago, a final chapter in a long, quiet illness that had kept him mostly out of the public eye. Robert had believed, like most others, that his parents' marriage had ended only in death. But perhaps, like so many of Sylvania's illusions, that too had been only surface. "He would have been almost 70, Robert murmured. Elias nodded. "Mama said she never expected it, but it happened." Robert sat back, struggling to reconcile the timeline, the implications, the weight of what Elias was telling him. If it was true, Milo wasn't just Joy's child. He was Robert's blood, his half-brother. The revelation hit with the force of a blow. It changed everything, and yet it changed nothing at all. Milo still looked at Elias like he was the whole world. He still reached for Robert's hand with trust unshaken. And Robert, despite the confusion roaring through him, still felt the same protective certainty he had felt the day Elias walked down that aisle and said one word, "Papa." "I need proof," Robert said, "not because I don't believe you, but because we need to end this fight. For good." The proof came in the most unexpected form. Later that evening, Mary Winters returned from a confidential meeting with one of the hospice administrators where Joy had spent her final days. She carried a soft, plush teddy bear, worn at the edges with a blue ribbon fraying at the bow. "She told someone to give this to Milo if anything happened to her," Mary explained. "The nurse forgot. She brought it to me today." Robert took it gently. It smelled faintly of lavender. As he turned it in his hands, he noticed the stitching along the back seam. Uneven, human, recent. He pulled gently. A small opening revealed a sealed envelope and a flash drive. He opened the envelope first. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Dear Robert, if you're reading this, I'm gone. and Elias did what I asked. He found you. I hope you listened. There's so much I wanted to say, but time was never on our side. First, you should know that Elias is your son. I tried to tell you. I wrote, I called, but I don't think you ever saw those messages. I don't blame you. I know how strong your mother is. I hope one day you'll forgive her. Milo is Williams. I didn't plan it. I didn't lie about it. But life surprises us, doesn't it? He was gentle with me, kind in a way I hadn't known in years. He didn't try to fix me. He just listened. He said he regretted so many things, especially how he had let your mother take control of everything. He said he wished he could go back and choose differently. He asked me to keep Milo safe. Now I'm asking you. I know this won't be easy. There are people who will fight you for both boys, for their names, for the legacy they threaten. But they are not a threat. They are your redemption if you let them be. On the drive, you'll find my full research, every note, every chart, every suppressed trial result. Do with it what you think is right. But please, above all, protect them. They are both yours. Joy. Robert sat with the letter in his lap long after the words had blurred in his eyes. When he finally stood, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, he called a press conference. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't read from a teleprompter. He stood behind a simple podium, holding the teddy bear in one hand and the letter in the other. He told the world everything. About the suppression, about Neosolva, about Joy, about Elias, about Milo, about William. He didn't spare his mother's name. He didn't flinch, and when he stepped down from the stage, he didn't walk away alone. Elias ran into his arms. Milo clapped from Lucy's shoulder. They had all lost something. A mother, a childhood, a company's pride. But in the wreckage, they had found something else. A family. Built not on image, but on truth. And truth, Robert had learned, could survive anything, even an empire's fall. The corridors of the Haverworth estate no longer echoed with tension. The silence that once crackled with uncertainty had softened into something new, an unfamiliar, warming quiet. It wasn't peace, not entirely, but it was the beginning of something close. The kind of stillness found in the early hours of a home that's been shaken and rebuilt, where the dust hasn't quite settled, but the structure stands stronger than before. Robert stood at the second-floor window of the West Wing nursery, watching as Elias chased a trail of bubbles on the lawn. The boy's laughter, once strained and cautious, now rang out in full color. His steps were light, his arms outstretched, spinning through the late afternoon air as though he were just a child again, and not the boy who had once walked into a stranger's wedding with a baby in his arms and the truth on his lips. Milo, too, had changed. The respiratory treatments were working, and with every passing day, the baby's color improved. His cries gained strength, and his eyes followed motion with alert curiosity. He had grown attached to Elias in a way no court document could quantify, and he had taken to Robert with an instinct that defied biology and logic. Whether he knew who Robert was, or what any of this meant, he showed it in other ways, in the way his tiny fingers curled around Robert's shirt, in the way he settled in his arms as if no other place could offer the same calm. Downstairs, the world still knocked at the doors. The class action suits against H-Tech had reached full swing, numbering in the dozens. The Department of Justice had launched a formal investigation into the clinical trial records for Neosolva. A Senate subcommittee had requested Robert's testimony, and regulatory bodies, both foreign and domestic, had sent letters of inquiry. It was the greatest reckoning the pharmaceutical world had seen in over a decade, and Robert was at its center, not as a villain to be crucified, nor a hero to be celebrated, but as a man finally taken responsibility. The board had not removed him. In a narrow vote, they had agreed to his terms. He would remain CEO until the full investigation concluded, under strict oversight and a restructured ethics committee led by external, independent members. Many had wanted a clean break, but the public's reaction had complicated their calculus. For every angry shareholder, there were 10 parents who had written letters. Some angry, yes, but others filled with gratitude that someone, finally, had acknowledged their pain. Robert hadn't expected forgiveness. He hadn't asked for it. But what had surprised him most was the quiet support he received from unexpected places. Former critics, long-retired researchers, even a few competitors who admitted begrudgingly that what he had done took courage. They didn't romanticize it. They simply respected that he had chosen truth over self-preservation. Sylvania had yet to be seen. Since the public revelations, she had retreated from every visible role. No statements, no press appearances, not even a discreet phone call. Her townhouse remained closed to visitors, and her name had been formally removed from the advisory board of H-Tech. Robert assumed she was orchestrating some manner of future resurrection or counteroffensive. But as the days passed, it became clear even she had been shaken. Not by the scandal, but by the fact that this time her control had slipped beyond retrieval. Her son had made a decision she couldn't reverse. Robert didn't miss her, not in the way a son might miss a parent. He felt the void of her absence like one feels the lifting of a weight that had been mistaken for structure. He saw now what he had never been allowed to name, a life shaped not by freedom, but by precision, curation, and the silent edits of someone who believed image was truth. The boys had changed everything. Elias, especially, had grown quickly in ways Robert found both beautiful and heartbreaking. He asked questions about the company, about medicine, about what made people do bad things even when they said they were trying to do good. He wanted to know what it meant to be a Haverworth. Robert had no rehearsed answer. Instead, he told him what he wished someone had told him. It means you get to choose who you are, not just who they say you are. The court had granted Robert full legal custody of Elias, citing biological paternity, emotional stability, and the child's stated wishes. The judge had even taken the unusual step of speaking to Elias privately, and afterward made the decision within minutes. Milo's case had been more complex. It had taken weeks of hearings, investigations, and expert testimony, including a DNA confirmation that he was, in fact, William Haverworth's son. Sylvania had submitted a sealed affidavit acknowledging this, along with an attached apology. Less for Robert, and more, it seemed, for the boy. Her last act of influence was to recommend that guardianship be granted not to herself or a foundation, but to Robert. The judge, wary of placing an infant with no direct biological parent into a high-profile home under media scrutiny, had hesitated. Until Robert presented Joy's letter, the same one she had hidden in Milo's bear. After reading it in chambers, the judge ruled decisively. "Let the brothers stay together," she said. "Let them grow up with truth, not secrets." Now they were both his, not trophies, not obligations, sons. He still called Milo his brother in private moments, especially when speaking to Elias. But at night, when Milo clung to him and refused to sleep unless Robert hummed a half-remembered lullaby Joy had once sung on an old hospital tape, Robert knew titles didn't matter. He had become what they needed. The house itself began to change. The east wing, once closed off for formal guests, was converted into classrooms and reading nooks. A woman named Clarice, a retired Montessori educator, came 3 days a week to teach Elias in a curriculum designed to let him grow at his own rhythm. The formal dining room became a playroom. The wine cellar was emptied and turned into a sensory learning space for Milo. What had once been a monument to legacy was now becoming a home. One day, as Robert reviewed grant proposals from medical institutions aiming to continue Joy's research, he found Elias sketching something at the corner of his desk. He had a habit of doing this, drawing quietly while Robert worked. Robert looked down and saw it was a picture of the house. Not as it was, but as it now looked. Toys in the courtyard, an open front gate, flowers blooming where statues used to stand. "I made it ours," Elias said. "It didn't look like a kid could live here before." Robert smiled. "Now it does." "And maybe other kids too?" Elias asked, looking up. Robert paused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there are other kids like me, like Milo. Mama used to say we weren't the only ones. Maybe we can help them too. Maybe they need a place." It wasn't a whim. It wasn't childish fantasy. It was a seed. And as Robert looked around at the house, a fortress that had once held only isolation, he realized Elias had just given it its next purpose. Within weeks, the paperwork began. The Haverworth Foundation, once used solely for scholarships and high-level philanthropy, was redirected. It would now sponsor housing, education, and legal assistance for children displaced by medical neglect or corporate malpractice. It would begin with one home, this one now renamed the Hunter House in honor of Joy. Eventually, more homes would follow. The vision was simple. No more secrets, no more silence, only safe places for truth to grow. One evening, as the sun set and painted the walls with long orange streaks, Robert stood at the front gate holding Milo on one hip and watching Elias play with a new boy who had just arrived. They ran through the grass barefoot, laughing, unburdened. Behind him, Clarice spoke softly to a newly hired counselor. Mary called from the study with updates on the Senate's proposal for new drug trial regulations. Everything was changing. Everything had changed. Robert didn't pretend to be perfect. He knew how much he had missed, how many lives had already been harmed before he opened his eyes. But as he held the boy against his chest and felt the heartbeat of something new being built, he understood this was not about erasing the past. It was about making sure the future never repeated it. Milo reached up and touched Robert's chin with a sticky hand, cooing happily. Elias waved from across the yard. "We're home now," he shouted. Robert nodded, whispering it more to himself than to anyone else. "Yes," he said, "we are." And for the first time in his life, he truly was. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Tap the bell so you never miss what comes next, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. See you in the next one.